días. Yo soy Maja Simunjac de la Universidad de Middlesex, que está situado en Londres, Inglaterra. Perdóname, pero mi inglés no es muy bueno, así que voy a hablar mi español no es muy bueno, así que voy a hablar en inglés. The research which I'm presenting today was done in collaboration with my colleagues from University of Zagreb, Dubravka Sinčić-Ćorić and Ružica Brečić. And what we were mainly interested in were political leaders. So we started from the premise that political leaders matter. What they say, how they say it, what kind of mediums they use, that this is important. And if you just think about the EU referendum which took place in the United Kingdom a couple of weeks ago, it is argued that the Leave campaign wouldn't have won if Boris Johnson didn't campaign for them. That's the guy with the yellow hair that looks like Trump. So it's argued that the voters voted for Britain to leave the UK because they were convinced by what Boris Johnson was telling them. At this point, we have to admit it's more a speculation than a fact. However, it does point to illustrate how important we perceive leaders to be in political communication. Now, there's a lot of research into the media coverage of political leaders, but there is far less research into how leaders communicate and what they communicate, and even less about how they aim to frame their image in the media. So we have aimed to kind of try to fill this gap. Also, we wanted to somehow focus on social media because social media represents this space in which political leaders can directly communicate with voters, which means that they don't have to go through the traditional media. They can speak and frame their image without interruptions. So basically what we wanted to examine was how does politicians' image framing on social media differ from that in the traditional media? In order to do that, we had to conceptualize what we mean by image framing. Now, if you think of business studies or marketing, image is a well-established concept, but it's not as established, or there isn't that much said about it in political communication. So what we've done is we've examined existing literature and explored political communication techniques which were related to image building, and we have conceptualized a model with 6 techniques which we consider to be important for promoting image in communication with media, but also on social media. And we acknowledge that this list of techniques isn't comprehensive, but we thought it being a good starting point, and they were also straightforward to research. Now, since we are considering this to be kind of an exploratory study, we decided to test it on a case study. And we have decided this case study to be that carried out in the Republic of Croatia, which is the newest member state of the European Union. And it is also a country that has a long history of political leaders dominating political communication. So we've done content analysis on the latest presidential elections, which took place in 2014-2015. We have analyzed statements done by the 4 candidates, which were published in traditional media. Our sample was derived from daily newspapers and on social networks during the duration of the entire official campaign, so it was around a month. The 4 candidates are from the left. Kolinda Grabar-Kitarović, who was the main challenger. Again, the guy with the blonde hair, that was Ivo Josipović, the incumbent. Milan Kujundžić, the guy who's very looking strict. He was a right-wing candidate who didn't have any kind of big support from parties. And the last guy, looking a bit like Jesus Christ, is Ivan Vilibor Sinčić, who was at the time of these elections an activist. So these were basically his first steps in politics. Our sample from traditional media was based on statements which were published in the daily newspapers. Now, Croatia doesn't have quality newspapers, so we had to focus on the most read half tabloids, and these are Jutarnji list and Večernji list, aiming to get any kind of political content out of Croatian media. The 2 social networks we analyzed were Facebook and Twitter, being they are considered to be most important social networks for the study of political communication, and they're also most used in Croatia. Now, just a first glance at the sample, it's obvious that there was a lot of focus on social networks. So out of 465 statements which were analyzed, 84% of all statements were published on social media. It's kind of astonishing that a daily newspaper, such as Jutarnji published 25 statements of all candidates during an election campaign. So the main focus was on social media. However, let's take a look at what was actually said in those statements. So the first technique that we've considered was how politicians talked about their skills and qualities in their statements. We've considered this technique as a technique of building heroes out of themselves. So politicians might talk about honesty, competence, trustworthiness, intelligence. So this is the bragging part. Our hypothesis was that the statements on social media will contain far more of these kinds of statements because, as I've said, they have this uninterrupted, unmediated space in which they can say whatever they want about themselves. However, we need to consider that these kinds of statements are also pretty newsworthy, so we've expected to see some of them in the traditional media statements as well. And our hypothesis was refuted. So as you can see, the blue columns represent the percentage of statements from traditional media in which the politicians are seen as talking about their skills and virtues, while the red ones are those from the social media. And overall, it appears that the social media was not used for this technique. So the politicians either didn't understand that they can use this to brag and to say how gorgeous and beautiful and excellent they are, or they didn't want to use this. The second technique that we've considered is talking about their private lives. So this is personalization topic. I think we have a whole session tomorrow on it. So talking about one's private life, politicians do it in order to normalize themselves, so to appear like one of the people. And we have also expected this technique to be more evident on social networks because this is considered to be the space where you share private information. However, as with the first technique, we've also expected to see some of it in the traditional media because, again, this is kind of newsworthy information. And again, our hypothesis was refuted. So as you can see, the blue columns are higher, meaning that, and that's the true for all candidates, so all candidates were reported in the daily newspapers as talking about their private lives far more than they did so on social networks. But it needs to be acknowledged that, you see, the columns aren't very big. So there isn't, the focus on sharing information about private life is not considered to be very welcome in Croatia, unlike, for example, if you think about the UK or the United States. And I think this kind of portrait of how politicians talk about themselves is perhaps similar to something you find here in Spain or, for example, in Italy and other Mediterranean countries. Next, we looked at what kind of language politicians used. And here we focused on whether or not they're speaking in first-person singular. I believe, I will, I think. Now, they can use this in order to portray themselves as doers, to put the focus on themselves. This is framing themselves as they're the one who are going to do things. And our hypothesis here, again, was that on social networks, you will have more of these kinds of statements. I mean, when you post on Facebook, Facebook tells you, what are you thinking about? So we kind of expected on social networks there will be more of these kinds of statements. But no. Again, the blue columns are higher than the red columns, and you can see that all candidates were reported more frequently as talking in the first-person singular in the traditional media than they did in social media. Now, I have to say we were really surprised by this, because obviously we expect them to have consultants, and we've heard from some of them today, to post things instead of them on Facebook or Twitter, but they could have hidden this somehow better, because compared to this, they didn't even try to portray themselves as speaking to the audience. Next, we looked at whether or not they were attacking their opponents. Now, if you think about the first technique, the communicating information about skills and virtues, as the one where they're creating heroes, this is the technique of creating villains. And this is part of what Edelman calls political spectacle. So they attack their opponents in order to frame their image in relation to somebody. Because you have to have an enemy, you know, being Batman, Superman, or whoever, you have to have an enemy in order to be somebody. Now, here our hypothesis was that more aggressive statements will be in traditional media. For once, because traditional media, they live on negativity. And the second thing is that since the majority of our statements was from Facebook, Facebook is a very happy network. You know, up until a couple of months ago, you didn't have any reaction except for a like. So it might be misplaced to attack somebody on social networks. And finally, we were right. So in traditional media, there were far more statements in which the candidates attacked somebody than that was the case in social media. And if you look, the main three candidates, they've attacked somebody in almost every other statement that was reported in the daily newspapers. And the only candidate who kind of attacked on social media was Kolinda Grabar-Kitarović. She was the main challenger, and her role was to challenge and to attack, so she wanted to get the job of the incumbent. So it again kind of makes sense that she did so. Almost finished. This is our fifth technique. So this is celebrity politics. So politicians like to be seen with celebrities in order to get some of their good image rub off them, but also because it's a technique how to get, for those voters who perhaps aren't as interested in politics, to hear what you have to say. This is former President Ivo Josipović when he met Angelina Jolie. Our hypothesis here was that this kind of technique could be used both in traditional and social media because it's newsworthy, and I would imagine that they would want to brag about it on social networks. The results show that this technique is basically non-existent in Croatia, and this is in line with previous studies done on the topic as well. So, up until now, we have established that on social media, politicians did not use first-person language. They did not talk about their qualities. They did not talk about their private life. They did not try to connect themselves with celebrities, and they did not attack their opponents. So what did they talk about? Did they talk about politics, international relations, economy, things that matter? Well, staying on message is also an image-building technique because you want to be known for what you're saying. You want to be known for what you stand up to. And I think this was one of the messages from our keynote in the morning. And our hypothesis here was that in the traditional media, the statements will be mostly focused on political content, while on social media, they will be somehow more personal. They will focus on the candidate's personal profile. And what we found is, again, no. So I don't think, you probably don't see this well, but all candidates, in all candidates' statements focused on social media was most frequently the campaign. So here is our new ad. We were here yesterday, the next rally is there, this is what the polls say. This, as you can imagine, wasn't too interested, these kinds of statements weren't too interested to the traditional media. Traditional media, on the other hand, most frequent focus of statements on traditional media was the presidential function. So candidates saying what they would do if they would be elected to the position. So if you're a voter and you go to a social media site during your electoral campaign, you will get information where's the next rally. If you open a newspaper, traditional media, and you read what the candidates say, you will get information about what this person would do if they would be elected president. Based on this, we kind of came to three conclusions. The first one is that mediated statements were more personalized and aggressive than social media statements. And this becomes a problem if the media has cherry-picked these particular statements because they're newsworthy. Because in that way, they are manipulating with the ways in which voters can see politicians framing their image. So they can be seen as being more aggressive or going more personal than they actually do. The second thing is that the mediated statements contain more political content than social media statements. And from our point of view, that kind of suggests that traditional media still remains, at least in this context, indispensable for ensuring informed citizenry. Because on social media was primarily used as a PR tool. It didn't communicate political information. It didn't communicate personal information. So there is all this underexploited potential. It wasn't used for informing voters. It wasn't used for building some kind of bonds with voters. But also, I think what we wanted to take away from this is that we have to think about the significance of new media in political campaigns. Yes, there's perhaps, it's new, it's interesting, everybody's on Twitter, everybody's posting something, but what kind of a role does that actually have? And I think if you think more globally, there are a lot of studies on this, and a lot of them were mentioned in the previous presentation. But if you forget for a second about Obama in the US, a lot of research actually says that social media in political campaigns is used as a PR tool. So what we kind of thought that this points to is that although new media is great and we should continue exploring it, we shouldn't forget or neglect the study of traditional media because we think they're still a very significant player in political communication. Thank you.